signori Olimpia.
Vieni, Olimpia.
Devo chiudere?
Sì, cammina molleggiando. Molleggiando sui fianconi. Posali la roba. Brava, adesso vai allo specchio.
Watching the film 8½, one might ask where Guido, the protagonist, lives. What is his home? In fact, Guido wanders between spas, hotel rooms, film sets, press conferences, between dream spaces, imaginary spaces, and real spaces. But nowhere he feels at home, at peace. Perhaps the most exemplary scene of this state of unrest is the audition scene where, on a theatrical set, a semblance of a domestic environment is staged with few resources, and where some actresses try to embody characters who, though resembling real figures from Guido's life, always prove unsatisfactory to him. Beyond the actresses' figures that Guido must choose what is interesting is the parsimony with which the domestic space is reconstructed. For Fellini, or for Guido himself, it seems that a realistic reconstruction of this space is of little interest, almost as if he does not care about it, or considers this space fundamentally ephemeral and fragile, simply the removable set design of a theatrical production. 2 years after the release of Fellini's film, Bob Dylan recorded a famous song, Like a Rolling Stone, which speaks of a character wandering aimlessly in places and situations in their life, in a way not dissimilar from how 8½, had revolutionized Italian and international cinema. Dylan's song marked a turning point in the singer's career and in the history of rock. This sense of rootlessness immediately gathers a vast consensus in the film and music audience and captures, so to speak, the spirit of the times. Dylan's song concept was born during a music tour in England and was partly inspired by life on stage performing to the audience. Guido also lives under the eyes of the spectators, trying to respond to the demands of those who ask him to make his film, and seeks to build a private space that paradoxically must be under everyone's gaze. Can this purely scenographic space in which the protagonists of Dylan's song and 8½, find themselves living be considered a home? Is it possible to live on a stage, with or without an audience? What kind of relationships can be built from such a space? What sense of belonging? This could be the question of a film like Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas, in which 2 ex-lovers confront each other. One of them is walking through the desert looking for the other, so he is basically without a home. The female character, played by Nastasia Kinski instead, lives in a fictitious room and speaks with invisible strangers through a tinted glass in a seduction game where physical contact is never contemplated. In Lars von Trier's Dogville, an imaginary village is brought to life through a brilliant set design. The houses that the characters reside in are marked only by signs on the floor, with no actual walls present. This setup creates an enormous empty space in which the concept of the house is nothing more than a figment of the characters' imagination, existing solely in their minds, as an act of faith. This psychological act of faith is not understandable for those who live within the 4 solid walls of a real home, but it is perfectly clear both to those who are without shelter and must build a protective space with their imagination, as it can be a homeless person, and to those who have the habit of living in imaginary spaces like a film or theater actor. Or, again, like a child who creates a small shelter by placing 2 chairs together covered with a sheet. Among the Italian neo-realist films that express this state of defenselessness, being without a stable shelter, there is Vittorio De Sica's masterpiece, Umberto D., the story of an elderly pensioner living in a rented room. In one scene of the film, the protagonist confronts the girl who helps with household chores, also uprooted and forced to live in another person's home without a personal space of her own. The delicacy with which Vittorio De Sica follows the small gestures of the girl and her dialogue with the elderly protagonist demonstrates how the 2 characters build fragile but authentic relationships based on the thin shell they manage to create in the vaguely hostile space in order to protect their individuality. This ability to build space more or less from nothing can be seen in documentaries about homeless people who, for example in California, are able to construct intricate spaces using recycled materials. It is no coincidence that the first great characters of Beckett's theater all have the appearance of homeless people, like Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot. The theme of being without a home, without shelter, is a constant presence in Beckett's work. His characters' spaces are temporary, deficient, poor, and bizarre. Like in the case of Vladimir and Estragon, it seems that the living space coincides with the stage space and is therefore exposed to the gaze of spectators, scrutinizing from the closed darkness. A space enclosed between permeable walls or even invisible ones, a space protected by a permeable fourth wall, such as in the case of the room in Paris, Texas, where Nastasia Kinski's character is confined. A contemporary artist who has produced a very brave work on private space and its fragility is Tracy Emin, who presented an unmade and messy bed, full of traces of her complicated private life, in my bed. The bed is the artist's last refuge, and can be devoid of the walls of the surrounding room, without losing its practical and symbolic value. It is what surrounds the body of an individual in the most physical sense, embraces, contains, and warms it. Thanks to a device invented in the late 70s, people were able to build an individual bubble while walking down the street, sitting in a train car or at a bar table. This device is the Walkman, which, thanks to a small pair of headphones and the sound coming from an audio cassette player, could isolate its wearer from the surrounding world, as we see in a scene from The Big Lebowski. Today, this device has been replaced by the smartphone, which can place us in the midst of crowds but still isolate us through its glowing screen in an intimate dialogue with our device. Spike Jonze, in Her, imagined that this device could contain a personality so fascinating that the human user of the device could fall in love with it. The character in the film Her is partly representative of each of us, except that for many users of mobile phones, the person represented on the device and loved by the user is a manipulated image of themselves. Even more so than a home itself, the mobile phone is a kind of animal den that contains the information, the image of ourselves that we want to produce, and the tools we need to move in society. A home, like in Madness' song Our House, in the middle of the street.
Our house in the middle of our street. Our house in the middle of our...
The need for a mental space becomes even more evident when individual physical space is disturbed or absent. This is the case with Guido in 8½, who wanders from place to place without finding peace, and the age at which one learns to construct this mental space is definitely childhood, an age in which the ability to find refuge in imagination is particularly active, and the ability to find mental spaces to protect oneself from trauma and exercise one's creativity is fundamental. We see this in Sean Baker's Florida Project, where a group of children carries their mental space with them, wandering in a desolate Florida and colonizing abandoned spaces, trying to intervene even just to leave a mark of their frustration and abandonment. As some examples of animal creativity are linked to their living space, such as nests or dens, we can ask ourselves how the idea of shelter or personal space influences creativity. What is the relationship between living space and creative space? How are the physical and imaginary spaces of childhood play related to the making of an individual creative space? Is the frame of a picture or the perimeter of a sculpture a space where our mind can dwell?
I don't have a home.
Anyway, I'm homeless again.
What's your address?
Look, I told you I'm homeless.